Howdy, my fellow randoms. My name is Kev Duffy, and welcome to this, our 28th episode of What's Your Random Podcast, where I discover and celebrate independent and individual creativity from the inception of an idea to the process and the practicalities of bringing that idea to life. If it's your first time here to the show, welcome. I hope you enjoy it. And if you're returning, if you came back, it means that you must have enjoyed a show in the past. So I hope that you go back and share that episode and share this episode and help us expand our reach to get into the ears of other creatives who may benefit and hopefully will benefit from the conversations that I have with my guests and all that they have to share. And I think today was definitely one such episode that is worthy of sharing. Joining me on What's Your Random Podcast were Terrance Daye, the director, and Keith Miller Jr., the executive producer of Pritty, the animation. And now that's Pritty, not Pretty, Pritty, not Pretty. And you could search for them, Pritty, not Pretty, on Instagram to follow their project. And while you're at it, pause this episode, as I say always, with every intention to come back, and check out their project on Kickstarter, support the project on Kickstarter. And I think it's good to engage with it on Kickstarter in such a way before listening to this episode so that you could really come into the episode with a little bit of an understanding of the visuals and the overall project that we end up discussing. It was an amazing conversation today. I was blown away by their project, even the limited amount of content that's shown on their Kickstarter portrayed to me a real depth of themes that are going into the making of this project and the narrative itself. And although it has such depth, they're still managing to create a subtle story that investigates the nuances of personal relationships and individual coming to age and their self-expression in juxtaposition to the environment around them, which may not always be receptive to who they are. You know, I love that I can relate to the characters and the moments that they're portraying in this story, but at the same time, they are giving voice and presence to underrepresented communities to which I don't belong. To me, that's a very impressive feat to make something somehow very specific to a certain group of people and give presence to those people, but at the same time, have universality in the humanity of the story. And I am really touched by what they're doing and how they're doing it. And on top of all that, I love the style and the animation. So I'm rambling a little bit. Without further ado, again, Terrance Daye and Keith Miller Jr. joining me here on What's Your Random Podcast. Enjoy the random.
It's North Carolina. Sorry, Kevin. I'm like giving your whole thing, but yeah, he's super sweet, and I'm happy to be here. I'm excited.
Yeah, but you should already know, Kevin, that you got tons of brownie points from the newspaper cap. So like, I already knew immediately this would be great. I knew this.
It took me forever to find I really wanted a short brim hat for the longest time, and like suddenly Amazon, after years of searching, Amazon knew that this was the one.
It came through.
Yeah, they found me. The hat found me. I didn't find the hat. Well, let me make a brief introduction and then we could continue rambling, and I'll try to steer us in some interesting directions as we go. Welcoming to What's Your Random Podcast, Terrance Daye, the director, and Keith Miller Jr., the executive producer of Pritty, the animation. And if I understand it correctly, it is a animation that is based on Keith's manuscript, and I'm excited to. There was so much to get into, and so many questions that I wanted to ask. And really, I apologize to Keith. I don't really come into podcasts with questions, but rather kind of bullet points and ideas. And
that's fine. Do you think?
words I pull out from your Kickstarter, and I hope to explore these over the course of our conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Yay. Thanks for having us.
We're happy to be here.
Yeah. So my first question, non-question, trying to make a question for you guys is, what is a day in the life right now for both of you personally, and then both of you professionally as it pertains to Pritty the animation?
Who wants to take it first? You want me to take it, Keith?
You go first. I gotta think about it.
Kevin, listen. I literally, so Keith and I just wrapped on a project, on a production that we were doing. We shot an independent proof of concept TV pilot. And that was a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting. We wrapped on that. Was it March 20th? And since, these past 2 weeks has sort of been, kind of just coming back to life a little bit. I think, Keith also has this, we kind of went right to work after we finished work. So we had this really big, heavy 6-day shoot, shooting 72 pages over 6 days in Hampton Bays on Long Island. And then, woke up the next morning and had to go back to my day job, which is an assistant for a director on an upcoming Disney Plus film. So, for me, my day to day sort of looks like waking up. I usually have a meeting or a general with somebody where I am, somebody who I met with somebody else one time and they were like, you got to meet this person. And, or somebody, who just reaches out and it's like, hey, I always love to meet and connect with new folks. So that's usually one of the meetings that I have to start my day off. Any of the other meetings will be meetings that I'm doing for that job specifically, hopping on, scheduling calls and all the, good, fun job of an assistant. But the director is great for that film. And he understands that I'm also an artist and gives me the space to do that. So amidst all of those work calls and some of those more general calls are also, specific to the art that I am making. So conversations around, whether it be Mandingo, budget, what to do next, post-production, which is where we're at right now with that particular project, as well as Pritty the animation and, making sure that we are keeping our Kickstarter up and reaching out to as many folks as we can and extending our reach as far as we can. And when that's not happening, I am trying to find literally like minutes and moments to have with my partner. Right now I'm in Brooklyn, even though I'm based out on Long Island, because my partner, Jordan, lives here. And so sometimes we'll just, he usually starts his day with some Wendy Williams and The View. And so I'll usually just be watching, eating some cereal in between that while he does that. Today I ran to the supermarket and made some Lego waffles or whatever it is called. I think back to my childhood, I had some waffles and watched and made some eggs. And we also just came back from a park. We kind of went to the park, which is something that we're trying to make more of a daily routine of. Before, I would say before kind of moving with Mandingo kind of to the point that we have, I used to kind of have a workout and all that stuff, but that's been since thrown out the window a little bit, hoping to get back to it. And I recently also bought a Nintendo Switch Lite because it was less expensive. And the new Pokemon game, I got Pokemon Sword, which literally I have not played Pokemon or video games in years since before college. But, I felt like I just needed a moment of just joy. And I'm so glad I made the purchase. And so I was at the park playing Pokemon. And,
awesome.
And that's a day in the life of Terrance right now.
That's a busy day in any life, I think. Was it, before we moved to Keith, was it always that busy, or is it just by the nature of the ebbs and flows of your work and your art kind of a lot coming to fruition at once?
Yeah, you know what? I think I get it from my mom. She does not stay still. Even on the weekends, she's working, and even her side jobs have side jobs type of thing. So I think I've always, even when I've had a necessary amount of free time, I've always tried to populate that time with something that that felt productive to me. You know what I mean? So whether that was reading or whether that was, I used to watch a movie a day and I'd read the script and then watch the movie, like that, like just using the time that I had to, feel like I was moving in some forward direction. Cause as you know, with art, sometimes it just feels like, oh, I'm just doing stuff and nobody cares and nobody sees me. But like little things like that, like working on my craft, so to say, was sort of things that I would always be doing. So I feel like to everybody else, it always seemed like I was very busy. To me personally, I always just felt like I wasn't doing anything. But yeah, you know, if it wasn't homework, it was that. And I would often get a lot of flack from friends in college who would just be like, yo, just chill out, like come to a party or, you know, this, that, or the third. But I feel like now everybody sees the, I guess the outcome, the fruits of that labor.
Yeah, awesome. It's good to see those things come to fruition. I definitely relate to looking like I'm really busy to everybody on the outside, but not necessarily feeling like I'm keeping up.
I'm playing
as
Pokemon
fast as I want to be moving myself.
That's what I'm doing.
How about you, Keith? What's a day in the life personally and with all your projects going on?
Well, for me, can y'all hear me clearly? Yeah, I had to put the headphones on. So also busy. My mom literally has my mom and my twin brothers live with me, and it's a continuing conversation of my mom being like, slow down, stop. Can you take one thing off your plate? And I'm like, it's going to get off my plate eventually when I finish it. And that's kind of how it works. So my day in the life, I get up really, really early in the morning. So usually the goal is to try to be up by 4 a.m. Because my full-time day job is I'm a deputy executive director at a youth arts social justice organization in Savannah. And so most of my full day, like from 10 a.m. to like 6 p.m. is focused on like leading a fairly large team and doing a lot of community-based work and running pretty much all of our programs. We have around 8. We serve almost a little over 1,000 young people a year. And in the midst of a pandemic right now, that's harder than it has been in the past. And it's kind of supporting the community to kind of get what it needs. And in my case, it's supporting the community and supporting my team as we kind of do that work. And in the midst of, you know, just finishing this really dope project with Terrance and then the animation, I don't know at what point I felt like I might have been in a little bit of denial when we were thinking like, oh, we'll totally just do this in March. Like, why not? We'll just do it all in March. And so we literally are running a huge campaign. It's like nationwide right now. While, you know, we managed 10 days of literal shooting. Like my brain hasn't caught up and it's amazing. And I'm like still, you know, chatting with actors and payroll and all that kind of stuff. And in my case, the blessing around this Kickstarter is that my once unknown manuscript is becoming a lot more known. And so I'm now having to have conversations with people who are interested in the novel and reading it. And so in my case, I rewrote the novel that I wrote 10 years ago. As a result, I'm also in school. I should probably say I'm in it. So I'm like, you know, I have assignments and I'm supposed to be working on a poetry chapbook. And if my professor hears this, I am working on it, I promise. But so, you know, there's all of that. And so for me, I have to also find a way to squeeze time in to finish edits to the novel and that kind of stuff to kind of get it out because people are now waiting for it. So that's kind of like the day in the life. I still try to find that time to I've gotten strangely efficient at taking like 20 to 25 minute quick naps. And that's like a budding superpower. And still trying to spend time with my brothers who are 15 and my mom, because we just literally also moved into a new house during the same month. And so I'm like trying to be present, even though I'm not present. So that's kind of what I'm up to these days.
I think I need a nap after just hearing how much you guys have been up to. That's will put anybody to shame, and good on you for maintaining that pace. Is for both of you, I guess this is a question for both of you. After you maintain such a pace, is there a crashing point like that you need a week to recover or more or less? Or is it, do you fuel yourself off of continuously going?
I'll hop in. I think for sure that in the past there have been massive kind of crashes and walls, but I think obviously it's like when that happens enough, you realize, okay, I have to prioritize not just the work itself, but also, you know, me, you know, as a human. And I think finding those little moments. So, my partner and I, we wanted to try to do a mini vacation, in between, because he's also very busy. So he finished something around the same time that I did. And so, we wanted to try to find some time to go on vacation, but as often is the case, like nothing is ever completely done, specifically like in finishing a film shoot. And for him, it was finishing a TV production. And it's sort of like there's still a lot that needs to happen afterwards. And as Keith knows, as an executive producer, you're closing out a lot of contracts, you're closing out a lot of, payroll, all this stuff. So there's still things to do. And I think you have to kind of prepare in advance and know that you have to kind of be gentle with yourself and what's the word they say, stagger, so that's why, those trips to the park. For me, being here with my partner before I head off to Baton Rouge, which is, the production for that Disney Plus film, like that's a whole other, that's going to be a whole other journey. And it's going to be a whole other lift, you know what I mean? Albeit not for myself this time, but for somebody else. But yeah, for me, in lieu of that trip that we were not able to take because we were both very busy, I purchased this Pokemon game. And that's given me, a little bit of reprieve to kind of just be a kid for a second and to zone out and worry about whether my Charizard is going to evolve or not type of thing. You know what I mean? Like, or whatever, that but like that notion.
No, I know all too well. That's why
I'm
like, yeah.
That notion of just finding rest in the midst of all of it. Like he said, with his 25-minute naps, which like you got to teach me, Keith. But yeah, that's how I say I fight back against those crashes, because it certainly comes sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really, they come, yes. But I think I've had to learn how to get, and it's still an imperfect journey, but I've been trying to learn how to understand what my body needs and to prepare. And I think that's something that me and Terrance have definitely been talking about. Like, how do you prepare for a blitz knowing it's coming? Mm-hmm. And then, like, as we were talking about, like the Kickstarter as it ends on April 1st, then we're also like, we're not going to keep going like round the clock at April 1st, at least for between April 1 and April 5. Like, let's take a break. Let's be with those we love. We love each other. That's great. But like, let's pause. Because, when you're thinking about like what it takes to do something like a campaign, you're constantly around the clock, and particularly with like a Kickstarter where you're watching those numbers and where you want the numbers to be. You're constantly firing off. Like, I find myself in the middle of the night at like 2, 3 in the morning, like, oh, we can reach that person. Oh, I'm gonna draft this language. Oh, I'm gonna send this to Terrance. Oh, wait, Terrance is sleeping, trying to rest. I will schedule the emails. So I think for me, recently it was leaning on, I have like a mini toolkit of sorts of like whenever I'm not feeling my best, whenever I'm like feeling low, or whenever I feel like I need to restore, there are small things that I do. And in my case, I'm in Savannah, Georgia. I'm a Southerner. I love seafood. And so what me and my family do now is I recognize that because I've been traveling and moving and all that kind of stuff, that my brothers, for example, and my mom, they hadn't really seen me. And so what I've been trying to do now is like, no matter what happens, we all eat dinner together. And we don't watch TV, during that moment. We'll sit and talk, like, how are you doing? What you need? How's it going on? Spring break. And then it's those little small indulgences such as, seafood. We don't eat it all the time, but I'm also pescatarian, so I really need to eat it. And so that's been really, really beneficial, but I can never overstate that one-on-one time, that me time where I can walk and pray and talk and dream, because I think where it restores me is me being able to be reminded and able to reflect and say, wow, I never thought I would be here doing this. And I want to do more of this. And so how do I make sure that when this part of the journey is over, I am well enough to move to the next part, and without over pouring my cup, because, this is very much a long game. And a marathon. And so I think part of that is us, weaving in those moments where we can rest too.
Yeah. I love that. There was so much in that statement and those statements that just resonates with me. And one question that I haven't asked any other guests yet, but it came to me recently that is a question I want to ask everybody is, balancing input versus output. And I think those moments by yourself, when you're praying, walking, decompressing, playing your Pokemon, like allowing yourself the moment to like just be without doing. Being is also a verb. You could do being in a way. And I think being is really important, and having those moments when you're just existing, but not necessarily having output. And I think you kind of already answered that question for me, Keith, and in a really nice way. And those, I like the idea of having a toolkit and kind of recognizing, when I'm feeling down, this is something I could go to, and conceptualizing those things is really important for me. And I think a lot of other creatives, and even people who are not creative, that they can have something to turn to when they need something to turn to. Yeah. Terrance, did you have another comment on that subject?
Well, yeah, I mean, like, Keith brought up the praying aspect, which he knows is something that is super like integral to our work process, or I'll say like, the work process that I have with my team, right? Because, thankfully it's not just Keith, but even on the Pritty side and on the Mandingo side, which is the TV show we were working on, there are, other really amazing, dope creatives and collaborators who are with us as well. And so oftentimes, in a leadership position on each of those teams, it's important, for me to know that I don't have all the answers and I don't have all the strength to do all the things. Right. And so I always try to start our meetings off with prayer first. And that's something for me. I come from a background of and so does Keith. Like, we come from the church, and my dad's still a pastor, and it's just something that's been instilled in me. And I think that, it's also something that keeps my perspective. And you talk about that input and that output. And I know that, I never have to exert myself to put out more out of an expectation or pressure or a fear that, we need to. And that's something I honestly really learned a lot from you, Keith. It's so small, but when Keith and I first met, we were like kind of just sending each other like movies and things to watch and things to do. And I remember sending him, was it The Wound, Keith, or something? And he was like, oh yeah, I'll watch it, but like, I'm going to take my time. Like, and I forget if you had watched Moonlight by that point, or if you were waiting, but like, I just really admired that he understood that for him, because of like, these queer Black films, like he just knew that like mentally, emotionally, he wanted to be in a right place to receive the movie, which is really like, you got to know yourself well, you know what I mean? To be like, oh, like, here, watch this movie, and be like, no, like, you're just not used to hearing people like, when you say, oh, watch this, for them to literally be like, no, I'll watch it later. And I just appreciated his transparency, and also like comfort to understand himself enough to be like, yeah, like, and to see it as a superpower, to kind of be able to check in with himself and to just gauge what he wanted to be taking in at that time. And that always inspired me as I would move on in this industry, right? Because it's so much of it is based around what you are doing, what you're not doing, you know what I mean? And you can kind of feel this anxiety or this need to put out, to be on social media all the time, to be, commenting to the times and to the issues that are happening. And I thought that was such a lesson that I learned. We met back in 2018, and that's something that I've literally carried with me all the way to this day, which is like, there are times where it's like, I'm not going to respond. I'm not going to hop on. I'm going to leave that for tomorrow. Like, that can wait. I can save that. And that's been really tremendous. And it goes, like I said, it goes back to that family, that thing that I learned kind of coming up, which is that, yeah, there's a higher power at work. God is, there's somebody else in control. So you don't have to do everything. And if it doesn't happen when you need it to, that's okay. Right. Like, what's for you, sometimes will find its way to you eventually. So that, I guess that's the other thing I would throw in there regarding that.
Yeah. And I would say one thing that's really cool to note about that is it's so hard to do that. And so like, I always have like a list or like a parking lot or the bike rack. There are all these terms for it. And part of, I think, I'm cracking up, by the way, Terrance, that's something that you remember after all these years. But part of what I learned is that particularly, as an artist, every artist has, an understanding of, the ways in which they're a vessel and how they move. And for me, I'm actually more of a conduit. And so I soak up everything. And so for me, like as a writer, like I have to be very clear, literally, like I have to be clear. And what Terrance knows is like, my goal is to watch every queer thing out there, particularly those of color. But, as long as it's international, I'm okay with it too. And as a result, and this is something that me and Terrance found out recently all the time together, is that part of why sometimes we have to say no, I'll wait, is because what we begin to realize is that queer narratives often re-perpetuate this process of trauma, and they leave you there. And so where you may be watching to see, oh, wow, will this couple make it? Will this young person evolve into a healthy, productive adult? Like, very rarely is that the case. There are often the similar tropes of like, oh, someone dies or the relationship never happened. And that's what you get for like, it's a very hard thing to experience, even when it's beautiful. And so oftentimes, particularly because we're both so committed to envisioning new futures of what's possible and pushing possible and naming possible and showing it, we can't always allow the same trauma that kind of exists, because sometimes when you watch a film like that, you are immediately transported. That's how trauma works. You're transported back to those disappointments, that ostracization, that bullying. And you're just like, now I forgot why I'm here. And now I need to try to patch myself together as I'm bleeding out. And so I think sometimes we have to be able to be like, ooh, I know it's great. That cover art is bomb. I will get to it when I can, while I take this time to craft a narrative that I hope will change the world.
Beautiful. Yeah. And that's one of the snippets I took from the Kickstarter, is that you guys wanted to flip the script and approach the narrative from a different perspective. And maybe this is one of the films that queer people of color, or anybody really, can go to experience another walk of life, for me, but relate to it and not have traumatic feelings or drama involved, but just a slice of life coming to age perspective. And yeah, it's not every day that I relate to a queer or film with people of color, because that's not who I am. But when I saw your trailer, it really resonated with me on a lot of different levels. And that's really powerful, to be transcendent. Yeah. And I wanted to talk to you also about Moonlight. So I'm glad that you brought it up, because for me, that's one of the films that explores these areas and that I'm not as familiar with. Right. Mm-hmm. And it leaves me with the perception that most of the stories, most of the time, are going to be like this. And I want to engage with it as a more ignorant person, or a person who has less exposure to those worlds and those people in a different way, in a more positive way. And that's what Pritty looks like to me from the outside. Yeah. And to transcend in that way is really beautiful, to be able to connect me to a story that you guys relate to, obviously, for obvious reasons, much more closely.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said being is a verb, and I think that that's one thing we don't, as Keith and I would be watching all these queer films, it wasn't even a, oh, we want to flip the script on the head kind of thing. It really came from a very personal place of like, dude, don't you love these movies? Yes. But don't you hate how they make you feel like this? Yes. You know what I mean? And as content creators, it only felt so natural to kind of be like, and I honestly, like, I'll speak really quickly to how Keith and I stumbled upon, the making of Pritty, the animation, which was that, and I think I mentioned in the Kickstarter a little bit, but I was kind of experiencing one of those crashes that we talked about earlier. After a film that I did, it was my second year film at NYU, a film called Hyphen Ship, a Visual Poem. the film would go off. It would win a prize at Sundance in 2020.
And listeners can view it on Vimeo right now, and it's really powerful. Yeah.
Thank you. But I mean, before even that happened, back after I had finished editing that film, which is probably about in May of 2019, that summer, I was sort of done with the film. Done in as many terms as possible. Like, I didn't want to play with it no more. I was done editing it. I didn't care about it. I was ready to move on. And not like, when I say I don't care about it, I just meant that like I got it out. I expressed it. It was a painful lift to kind of express it and articulate it, but it was out of my body. I needed to finish it to get it out. So it was out. And so I wanted to, it also kind of like gave me a lot of learning lessons when it came to film. And I think a lot of those bumps and bruises and scrapes made me, kind of solidified me on this kind of personal feeling of like, okay, yeah, I'm done with film altogether. Like, I don't want to make any more movies. I just want to stick to my first love, which is writing, and call it that. And I was actually I was in the second round for the Emmy TV internship or fellowship, which would have had me go out to LA and intern in a writer's room for TV, which is what I wanted to do. TV writing is always something that very specifically I wanted to do. And so I was like, okay, perfect. This is going to be, this door is going to open. I was in the final round. I'd been wanting to do it for years. And this was the first year that I actually was able to apply. And I felt really good and confident about it. Ended up getting a rejection letter. That kind of broke me. And I reached out to one of the people who wrote my recommendation letter, who happened to be the showrunner for Empire on Fox at the time. The summer before, I had interned at Empire in the writer's room. And so I reached out to him and just said, hey, it didn't happen. I didn't get the thing. And he was like, well, great. Like, that's fine. You can come out and work here again over the summer. And essentially I was paid to shadow him in the writer's room, which was really incredible. And so I felt, wow, here's, this is perfect. This is great. This is all that I've been looking for, right? Like, the thing that I got told no for technically still works out because I'm interning at a TV writer's room. And I worked there the summer before, so I'll be able to cultivate those relationships, et cetera, et cetera. So I was over the moon and ecstatic and said yes right away. And it wasn't until I told my parents, who weren't as ecstatic, because they were kind of like, you're going to LA? Like, why don't you stay home? Why don't you look for something in New York? You know how parents can be. And I remember, like, my first reaction was anger. Like, I was angry. Like, why aren't they happy? Why don't you guys just congratulate me? And I remember, getting on the train to ride into the city. And I was just sitting with myself, having one of those, one-on-one moments like Keith mentioned. And again, like I said, spirituality, talking with God is the whole thing. And I remember getting that check in my gut where, I felt like the Holy Spirit was like, check your anger. Cause I was mad. Like, I was mad in the way, like, when you just want to call people and talk about, like, I was that kind of mad. And I just kept feeling this check. And then I heard so clearly, like, did you check in with me? Like, did you pray about this? Right? Did you make this decision based out of a fear that if you didn't take this, you wouldn't have anything going on over the summer, right? Like, that you wouldn't have anything else, that you need to figure out a way to kind of, now that you've closed this chapter with filmmaking, to really establish yourself in the TV writing space. And is that really why you took this job? And when I sat with that reality, I had to admit, yeah, I did not. I made this decision based out of this fear that, what I needed to happen, I needed to make it happen somehow. And that the people at Empire or the showrunner is going to make it happen for me. Right. And literally it was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, which was to call him back up and be like, thank you for the offer. I know I said I would do it, but I'm actually going to stay home in New York this summer. Had no idea why, had nothing going on, but just felt very strongly that I needed to just be home in New York that summer. And with that free time, as I mentioned, I usually try to find something to do. And I was like, well, let me go ahead and finish the coloring and the sound on Hyphen Ship. And also in the meantime, while I was doing that, I was just watching a lot of queer coming of age films because, like I said, I was still experiencing that come down from the rejection from that fellowship and the kind of the feelings I was feeling about Hyphen Ship. And I was watching a lot of queer coming of age stuff. And, my mind started to travel to this imagery of boys in water. For whatever reason. And again, I was like, I'm not doing another film, but maybe I'll do a 3-channel video installation piece, like it exists in a museum. Cause that's how the poet in me works. I'm like, and I was like, I just kept thinking about this book that Keith had sent me back in 2018 or the summer before. And I was like, let me reach out to him and just let him know this is something I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about doing this kind of triptych visual, not a narrative, nothing like really filmy, just kind of like images of boys in water. And I just wanted him to know that I was inspired by, what I read in Pritty. And he wrote back and was like, cool, go ahead, do that. How much do you need? And I was like, I don't know, $5,000. And he was like, okay, cool. I can bring that in. What does that mean in the film world? Because Keith wasn't as familiar with film then. And I was like, I don't know, like maybe, I'll just make you an EP, make you executive producer. And so he was like, cool. And that's what that was. And I look back on that summer and, eventually that would grow into me sitting down in July of that summer to write a script, which would become Pritty. And it would send us on this journey and trajectory that we're on now. And, Keith and I would have these conversations that led me to the conclusion that Pritty had to be a narrative because, all these queer coming of age films, like I mentioned, that we were watching, we're all doing the same thing. And it was like, well, here's an opportunity, right? If I'm writing a script, I might as well actually make it narrative. And this is the perfect opportunity to be able to kind of push back against all the things that we're seeing. So long story short, if that summer hadn't happened the way that it did, if I had gone off to that TV writer's room, I would have been solely focused on that. And I would not have finished Hyphen Ship, which would end up getting into Sundance in that fall. I wouldn't have even applied because I applied that summer. And similarly, I would have never really cultivated the relationship with Keith like we did because I would have been all the way out in LA. I would have been focusing on something else. And I would not have had the time or, kind of foresight to sit down and write Pritty. So it's just been an amazing and beautiful journey that brought me here, but all from that censoring and all from that making sure that I, checked in with myself. And I forget the initial question that sent me off on this rant.
That's okay. I never remember my own questions.
I felt like it was important to give that context to how, Keith and I and Pritty really came to be. Because, again, like without that summer, I don't think we would have really dived into it the way that we have so far and committed to it like we have up to now.
Yeah. And it sounds like that summer was a moment of pause for you. You were being creative, but a little bit more passively creative, and if that makes sense, and maybe had some more inputs as opposed to more outputs that allowed you to arrive where you are today with Pritty. And yeah, I wonder, because I am not as familiar with the genre, like, are there any other movies in the queer coming to age space that are more slice of life and celebrate more so than, like you said, reopen those wounds? Are there any that come to mind? Or for people listening, do you have a recommendation of, did any inspire Pritty at all in terms of how you approach it and kind of explore it, but not explore it in such a traumatic fashion?
Yeah, I have an answer, but I'll hand it to Keith, who's like a connoisseur at all things queer coming of age films.
I think I would say this, and I think often back on that moment, because I remember I too love the abstract art space. My mom, growing up in Savannah, she was actually a security guard at a big museum here, and so I was the little kid running around chilling, eating tangerines, until she got off work. And so I've always kind of been a big fan of that. And I remember when Terrance came back to me and was like, "Oh, hey, so I have written a thing," and I was like, "Written?" What do you mean? I loved it because he prefaces by saying, so I said an exhibit, but I could not get this scene from the book out of my head. So read it and just let me know what you think. And so what it really kind of sparked is this realization that for the first time for me, because you got to remember, I had written Pritty 10 years ago and had gotten all the no's and all of the, hey, this is great, but it won't sell. And so for me, I just would just casually share it with people who seem to be aligned with it. So to see him be inspired by something that, you know, in my brain, it's like, it's just regular. It's like something I wrote. And for him to put his own spin on it was like, I think really, really, really powerful. And I think when I think about, I should point out by saying that when Pritty, the manuscript was written, I don't remember seeing any queer coming of age novel or any queer anything outside of, I think it was around that time that Noah's Ark by Patrick Ian Polk, I think it was, like that television show kind of came out. There were some smaller things, but outside of that, they were only primarily like white narratives. And I think for me, I had gotten tired of trying to place myself in a narrative that wasn't for me. And so more recently, what I've been really happy to see is most narratives kind of still have to go through that process because there is pain, there is ostracization, there is trauma. Absolutely. There is universal trauma of just being a teenager. Can we start there? Period. So when you add what it means to be a body of color and you add what it means to be queer on top of all of that, it's hard. It's completely hard. Now, what I have seen, and this is where Moonlight like brought me to tears, is that by showing that is hard, but there is more to the story is where I kind of get captured, right? And what Moonlight did that I hadn't seen really anything do before then was it showed a duality that exists for many, particularly I would say Black male identifying individuals, where a lot of what conversations are happening is it's around masculinity. And that at the heart of homophobia is misogyny, right? And so there are a lot of things that were happening there. And so what struck me completely when I saw Moonlight was, and I always think back to all my worst days, I always watch Moonlight. I literally watch and I'll fast forward to my favorite scene, which is the diner and then the ending. And what I saw is just this beautiful sense of hope. The fact that they did see each other, the fact that someone did pick up the phone after years, and the fact that we are left with possibility. Another good movie that just came out that I am obsessed with is a Chinese movie called Your Name Engraved Herein. Phenomenal. It has some of the same beautiful visuals of bodies and it's a story with a backdrop of like literally coming out of oppression, the country, right? And so that to me is something that kind of does what I've been looking for. And then I'm going to share this because you may be about to say this too, Terrance. Me and Terrance, so when Terrance came down to Savannah, obviously we ate seafood, walked around my neighborhood, and obviously watched just a bunch of queer films. And I remember us both discovering, I think it's called Tremulo.
Mm-hmm.
What it's called?
Trimmer.
Now.
Finish,
Trimmer.
Yeah.
Trimmer
Yeah.
is that.
It's Tremulo, but yeah.
Yeah. Look, short film stole both of our hearts. And what it did to us is it also showed that play and that a narrative can play with us and can play with our suspense and thinking that we know what is, and then kind of flipping the script on us. And so to me, I'm seeing a lot more examples, particularly internationally, of Thai dramas, Korean dramas, primarily like some Korean movies, who show us what's possible. And so in Pritty, I think I still have yet to see anything in animation centered around bodies of color who are queer, period. So that's why Pritty is kind of the first to do that. But two, I have yet to see, this is the final thing I'll say, I have yet to see a narrative that even dabbles with queerness at the intersections of what it means to be a person of color with their stories at the center. Because often we see the body of color is always the magical, and I don't doubt it is magic, right? That is true. I feel that way. But we're always pushed and relegated to the sides. And no matter what the story is, and I think it's Toni Morrison who would often talk about Black people often being the plot and the narrative, the actual verb to a white story. And so I think what we were really trying to do in this case is say, no, our stories, our people, our hoods, and all that encompasses, our existence deserves to be center and the point in the story, and to show and celebrate within that moment trauma and healing, what's possible, the joy, the beauty that is there for people who are willing to. Because at the end of the day, although Pritty is a queer narrative, it is a universal queer narrative, because we all know what it means to not know who we are, to dare to show ourselves to the world and risk being accepted or not. And that's something that anyone, no matter how old you are, no matter what your color is, can experience. But for some of us, there are other layers to that make it a bit more complicated.
I just wanted to hop in real quick for two things. So I actually watch a lot more animation than I think Keith maybe than you do. But like I do know that there are queer, like Black queer animated characters, right? We see it in Steven Universe. We see like they exist. We see it. I think Kipo is another one, but I think that center part is really important, right? And then this notion of just allowing them to be, and I'm specifically thinking about like Black characters as well, because they're also really beautiful Asian animations, or and that feature people of color, same-sex people of color on screen, but specifically talking about Black characters, and then specifically making them the center, and on top of that, just allowing them to be, and not needing to quantify or validate their being with pain and with trauma, to say, well, here's the reason why to watch that. And for me, the film that always stood out, even as I was thinking about Pritty, was Call Me by Your Name, because while, thoughts about the film aside, what that film did, I did see in that film that I hadn't really gotten to see anywhere else before, was that there was nobody keeping these characters apart. There was no real antagonist outside of themselves and time. And that was very new, right? Because usually we're all waiting for the parents. Like as soon as the parents find out, they're going to break it up. You know what I mean? Like as soon as that one person, the girlfriend, finds out, she's going to try to break it up. And it was like, there was none of that. Everybody was actually receptive, and in a beautiful way. It was so refreshing. And I remember seeing people old and young, queer, not queer, walking out of the theater just crying, and that father monologue at the end of that is devastatingly beautiful. And I just remember thinking, wow, the last 20 minutes of this film really like brought me to tears. And even just the notion that they got to go on vacation together, right? Which is like, again, not something you get to see often. And so, my first thought was, dang, I want my parents to watch this. Do I think they'll sit through 2 hours of these beautiful white boys on the Italian Riviera? No. But I was like, I wish somebody could do this for Black bodies, Black characters, to see Black boys experience this level of joy and freedom and uncheckedness, so to say. And that's what really had gotten my wheels turning about when we were thinking through Pritty, and what part and aspects of the story were we going to put in this short adaptation, right? Obviously the novel encompasses a whole lot more life and drama, but for this short, it was like, well, hey, I think there's an opportunity here to actually see and experiment with a world where all those expectations for a bully to come in, or all those expectations for somebody to become the antagonist in this space, kind of get flipped and turned on their head, so that what actually happens is that these two boys are allowed to just be and have conversations and discover things about themselves and the other in this very subtle and nuanced way, right? Because ultimately it happens in real time over the course of like 20 minutes. And that entire time we're breathing with them. We're floating in the water with them. We're living through those awkward silences and those, those firsts, which for these young boys, and as Keith mentioned, the universality, we've all been in that place at some point or another. I just thought that was important. And that's something I felt like I don't get to see enough of.
Yeah. I mean, the pilot or the test, the animation test is, I don't know anybody who would not connect with the flirtation at the pool. And it is very artfully and subtly done in a way that feels very natural. So I'm kind of putting us in all different directions there, but as points come to me, I just like to make them and ask the question as they arrive. And one of the questions I have is, as a director coming from film into animated short, and just in general, how do you direct for that tone? And then to put it towards Keith as well, I haven't read Pritty, but I also assume that it was written in that way, that you have this tone in the writing, that it's, and by the way, I use the term slice of life as like the highest compliment. It's one of my favorite genres. And I think there is real art in the subtleties of creating this ambiance and this natural environment that feels inviting and real. You know, and that's what I felt even just watching the quick sketches of the pilot animation you guys have at the end of your Kickstarter. So how do you direct for that? And how do you also write to strike that chord while avoiding not having enough? Mm-hmm. Right? Because the birds are flying through chirping, and you know, one boy looks at the other with a slight smirk, something like that, right? How do you achieve that?
I love this question. Keith will hop in, but like, yo, this is like my bicycle wheelhouse. Like, shut up, Keith. Kudos, all my hats go off to Keith. Keith is an author, right? Like, I feel like if I could write the way that Keith does, I would not be a filmmaker. I would be my old little poet self. But Keith brings such a beauty and a specificity to his language, to his words. You see it, right? Like, so it's like in terms of my work as a director, the hardest part sometimes is seeing the thing, right? It's like you have to bring this thing that is in your imagination. And you might, like, for me, I'm very sensorial, so I can always feel a thing, but sometimes it's harder to see a thing. Right. And the beauty and the ease, I think, for Pritty, for me, was that like there was so much material to go off of. Like, there's a clear world here, and that I'll let Keith speak on later, all to his words. But, when we actually moved into the animation space, the thing that was really cool is that we have to make all of this from scratch, right? So now we have to bring this to life from scratch. And previously, when we were doing the live action version, I went down to Savannah. Keith actually walked me through all the places that, because parts of Pritty, the novel, are inspired from Keith's own background, having grown up in Savannah, and et cetera, et cetera. So
just for background for listeners, because of COVID, you guys had to put the kibosh on filming a live action adaptation. Exactly. And that's like another question I would love to explore with you guys.
Yeah. So a week out.
Please continue with your train of thought. I just don't want people to get lost who are listening.
Of course. But yeah, a week out from production, we got stopped because of COVID. But before that, when Pritty was a live action, I went down to Savannah, and Keith walked me through all of the specific locations that, were important in the book. And we scouted various pools to kind of find the right one that was based in a community. And so we had a lot of the spatial reference to go off of, as we transferred into animation and as we engaged these animation studios, a lot of the actual locations that we had planned to shoot in would become the references for the space. Right. So that part wasn't too hard of a lift. When it came to those small nuances, those small moments, and the writing, I'm always thinking about in the writing of the script, which is a little different from the writing of the book, right? Because the script is specifically written with the idea that somebody is going to be watching, right. And so there are a lot of things that I wouldn't include that Keith might have included in the book that I'm trying to think about how to synthesize into a moment. And something that we never lost sight of is that this is a story that takes place in the Deep South, right? And the Deep South is charged, especially when telling stories of color and specifically stories about Black people, is charged with a lot of history, is charged with a lot of trauma. And so, I knew that there was a level of tension that I wanted to bring to it because there wasn't going to be as much conflict because there is no antagonist. As you mentioned, birds are chirping and, wind is blowing. And how do you make these things feel tense? And so I already knew that the juxtaposition of our geography, which isn't something that is explicitly spoken about or discussed, but that held value and importance, right? And so all of that is things that for me, I was thinking about as we are just being allowed to be with these boys. And obviously the full script isn't available to everybody, but there are all these different moments and conversations that are had, that I think seeing Black characters engage in this dialogue and specifically making sure that this felt like a hood, right? Like that you can see story being told just by looking at a still image of the environment, right? It's like, it's not the latest and most up-to-date community pool. It's very much, a community space, and you learn about that community in what you do see of it. And all that to say, I'm also thinking about, for me, with some of the themes with Pritty, all about visibility and being seen, and the fear of that sometimes as a queer person or as somebody who's still wrestling with their identity, but also the freedom of that when you truly are seen. And so eye contact and where the eye is being directed, all these things are informed very small and very subtle moments, because ultimately we need to know what the characters are thinking about, because they are who ultimately root us in that moment and in that space. And so as when we were doing the live action, it's important for me to know where the camera is and what the camera is seeing. And so I had done a lot of work and preparing for the live action to determine where that camera needed to be and what that camera needed to be seeing, and specifically how that camera placement was elevating the very subtle story that's being told, right? Elevating that tension, elevating that anxiety that Jay is feeling when he first arrives at the pool. All these very subtle things that have a psychological and emotional effect on us as audience members. And then part of the soundscape is making that feel immersive so that you really forget that you're watching a movie, you know what I mean? And you're not waiting for the bad guy to run in, but you're just, you're kind of releasing some of those expectations to just be with these characters. So all of that to say, when it came time to the animation, I actually felt very prepared to direct the animators in terms of one of the first notes that I had for them when they sent back the initial first pass is that we need to be in Jay's POV. We need to be in his perspective. He is our main character. They initially had a lot of objective shots where it was sort of like, where is the camera? Who, kind of in terms of who's
setting the scene and just showing the environment.
Yeah, you know what I mean? It was like we would see Justin jump into the pool, but it wasn't from Jay's POV. It was just from some other POV, and realizing that changes the audience's relationship to Jay, and we need us to be rooted with Jay in order for this story to land, because it is so, ethereal and that feeling. And that's something I wanted Pritty to feel like a breath, but in order for us to still feel like a story is being told and that we're with a main character, that point of view, which essentially is where that camera is important every step of it. So these are things that, conversations that I'd have with the animators as we were, moving through and kind of finding that language together. I would say I felt really, that transition felt very natural. And like I said, a lot of that had to do with Keith bringing it to life so much so that we could easily identify when it wasn't what we needed, but also we had the language to kind of steer it in that right direction. And thankfully Powerhouse Animation Studios, they're awesome. They went with us and they watched everything we had to give them, from all the test footage that we had from the live action to various live action visual references that we had from movies that we loved, like Tremulo. But I'll let Keith hop in and speak to the actual writing of Pritty.
Before we move on to Keith, I'd like to point out that I think it's a really awesome point, because my impression is that Jay's brother is Jacob.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's my impression that Jay looks up to his brother, and Jacob is kind of the portrayal of the more masculine, typical, standard archetype, let's say. And I think it's really awesome that you said creating the shot from Jay's perspective was important to root him as the main character, and also to give that perspective of how he sees his brother. It's like a hero shot, right? He's jumping in a pool doing a cannonball. That's a hero shot. And finding ways that aren't necessarily looking at Jay's face, but then that can still exude his emotion and build him up as a character. I really appreciate you illustrating that point, because it kind of gives us an understanding of your layer of craft and the depth of your craft.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Keith. Now, please. The question that we asked originally was about the subtleties of writing towards subtleties and making sure that you're not underwriting, but also that you're not overwriting and tying it into a beautiful narrative.
Yeah, I think something that I love and that Terrance is truly gifted at is being able to see those subtleties. And I think it's something that we remark about all the time when we're watching films. It's like, I'm obsessed with indie films in particular because they're so quiet. And when I think back to the hardest, most difficult, but the most peaceful moments, the memories literally that I have of those moments are encaptured in these really small moments. And so for me on the page, it's a different medium, right? And so, and then the novel, that scene is written from Jay's voice. Jay is the one telling that story. And so there are certain things I kind of have to play with, but, we're playing with language and all these things. But what we're really seeing in this moment is Jay, who is trying to get out of the shadow of his older brother, going to this moment of huge vulnerability at the pool. He's trying to figure out his body at the pool. Everybody half naked. That's the point, except Jay. Right. And so you have this moment of water itself. Water is a theme in the novel, certainly. And I think one of the things that I just wanted to focus on is, what does it mean to say and not say? And what does it mean to be seen, to want to be seen and not be seen? And who gets to be seen? And so it is in these quiet moments that we observe some people's superpowers and being able to see a version of you that you don't even know exists. And so in that particular scene with Jay and Justin meeting each other, it should be noted that like those floaties that we see on just Jay are like, he's 16, 17 years old. Nobody wears floaties to the pool. Like, even if you can't swim, you would rather drown than wear these floaties. But it shows us a little something about Jay. And so I think in that moment when we see on the page, those small moments, those beats, I play literally with silence on the page. Literally it's written out where that awkward silence, that moment where we're seeing those eyes, where is Jay? Where does Jay feel allowed to look at when he sees Justin? Where does he feel compelled to look, right? And particularly, what are we hearing? This is a community pool. There's a lot going on, but yet it's silent, right? And so I think really on the page, my focus was, if you really bring it to the moment of reality, then you really strike a chord that there is music in the most simplest moments of our everyday lives. And that's what I'm obsessed with. I think it's easy to get lost in this idea of action, but the most heartbreaking moments is when you are looking for someone to look back at you and they don't. When you are waiting for someone to speak out on your behalf, and they don't. And then what I get the privilege of doing as a writer that is, you can't always convey on film is I get to allow you to feel that cringing, that sadness, that space of that happiness, that happy, sad, right? The happy, sad, joy, laughter, all of that really quickly. And the final thing I'll say is I'm obsessed with those moments of on the page, I have to still think through what this scene looks like and where we are and all the technical, all the logistics, right? And so in this moment, I'm going to reference probably an animation that I have watched literally 6 times the entire season. It's called Beastars. It's on Netflix. It's hilarious because it's little animals. But I have never in my life seen something bring human qualities so clear to life. And there's a moment where the main character, the wolf, is talking to his friend, the Labrador Retriever. This all sounds so hella simple, doesn't it? But let me tell you, watch it, please. And there's this moment, and I see this as an art form in Japanese animation all the time. This is why I like get giddy. He's talking about a moment that just happened and trying to figure out if his friend realized that what he witnessed was a problem. In the midst of this conversation, we see a small puddle because they're sitting in an empty pool. We see a small puddle with some butterflies drinking. It's like 4 or 5 of them. And they're sitting there. And you don't see anything important because their wings are up. So it's just butterflies, water, and the conversation. And at the moment when the wolf feels seen and heard and he tells the truth, the butterfly's wings open. And there's a moment of like, oh, this is important. I feel like the hardest job of every writer is to convey that moment in a way that gives you every sense, but sometimes you can't see. And so it may be on the page, it may be the sound of the favorite car, the car rattling, and the bass in the trunk, right? It may be the fact that Jay walks up to the pool edge and everyone laughs. We don't know what they're laughing about, but we don't have to because Jay is fearful because we're hearing, laughter and who would they be laughing at but him, from his perspective. But most importantly, we see the body. We get to feel what it means. And so something as simple as, in the larger part, actually Justin and Jay have a moment in the pool where like Justin, proceeds to literally try to get him into the pool. And it is on the page. It is the way that their bodies make sense of what it means to touch and be touched for the first time for the sake of just being. And so I think the only thing I try to do is to try to find that moment of transformation in the everyday. And if I can do that, then I always strike the right chord. And sometimes it's in those small moments that we experience our worlds being made and destroyed all at the same time.
And is it a matter of using, for example, the butterfly to help highlight a specific moment?
Yeah, it is literally about playing with the literal representation of silence on the page. It is literally breaking lines so that if you break lines and the sentences are short, then there's a faster pace. If you kind of drag it out a little bit, it allows people to kind of digest. I should also point out that that's where you also play around with like the words you use are also important. So in a lot of those moments, it's primarily dialogue, which is from the writing standpoint, it allows you to get lost and immersed. But from Terrance's talent, he can then take that moment of dialogue where I can only talk about, hey, that thing, or we hear this sound. Terrance can then take that moment and paint a powerful picture and using the camera show you and play with what you can and can't see. So it becomes this really powerful thing. The page can do some things and the camera can do some things, but the true talent, I think, of Terrance is because he is also a writer, again, a poet, he can see really what must exist on the screen for you to feel the full experience as much as you could as if you were reading it, and then some.
And going back to the example of shooting the cannonball from Jay's perspective, right, as opposed to from a third person.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because you made me remember this, like it was a very specific moment in my coming of age journey, which for me was there was this boy that it was the first person that I would ever eventually end up dating. But it was like my freshman year of college, and I was at Morehouse, which is this all Black boys school. And there was this boy that I had the biggest sort of crush on. And he presented very masculine. He was he identified as straight. But I remember we came back to my dorm room, he, myself, and a few other friends after a big debate on campus. And so everybody was sort of talking about the politics of this big debate. And it's so simple. It's so subtle. Like he was eating a bag of Skittles. I remember. And I just remember everybody was talking, and I like asked like, hey, can I have a Skittle? continued with the conversation as if I had never said anything, didn't even really acknowledge that I was there, but just kind of kept going. And I remember I asked again, I said, hey, can I have a Skittle? Nothing. Continue on. I asked a third time. And same thing, you know what I mean? And I felt crushed in a kind of very private way. You know what I mean? Like, dang, like, I guess, you know, bump me. And the conversation essentially, you know, eventually died out and they left the room, and I was left alone in my dorm room for a moment. And I remember going back to my laptop, which had been opened, you know, the whole time, and sitting on the S key was a red Skittle. And it was such a small private moment, but it was so intimate. Because he heard me, you know what I mean? And that was just something that I remember always feeling so seen. And I like, and when I think about Justin and Jay's character, and as I was just writing that, I just remembered he and my dynamic, you know, kind of coming of age in that space, which is very much like a lot of surveillance, a lot of eyes. It's an all boys institution. And it was small moments like that communicated so much. And so, you know, just remembering what it is to be young and what it is to be, to communicate in that way with a person, right? How eyes or subtle touches or things like that, how powerful that can be to the person receiving it, and validating many times. And so I think, you know, that's a feeling that I really wanted to capture. And Pritty gave me an opportunity to really explore and try to replicate, you know, with new characters in a new space, but to replicate that very, you know, real feeling for me that you can't ever get back again. You know what I mean? You can't make those things up. And they stay from, you know, I still think about that moment. Like, they stay with you. So.
Yeah. And I think simple adjectives don't describe that moment, right? The
feeling
that you have, the feelings that you have in that moment you could only share with somebody by telling the story that you just did. Right. And by, through your art and your craft, putting it onto screen in a way that emphasizes
and dramatizes
certain aspects of that moment, as Keith eloquently said. Awesome. I also want to ask about the adaptation itself. So what portion of the book is this short film, animated short, a snippet of? What part of it does it capture? And what changed, if anything? And I think I know one addition to the animation, but I'll let you guys speak to that.
You want to start off, Keith?
Yeah. So, so this is literally almost smack dab in the middle of the novel, maybe just before the middle point. And it is a powerful moment because it is a moment where literally Jay first meets Justin. And so it is like that moment right there. And it follows a huge climactic moment where like people are trying to figure out, oh my goodness, what's going on? And so it's one of those moments, those valleys, I would say, where we need to restore and be rebuilt, and everyone wants to know, what is Jay gonna do? What is he doing? How is he doing? And so it becomes a moment really almost at the midway point where we have just that scene. And that scene is actually a longer scene, but what Terrance captures is that moment where they're walking to the pool, they get to the pool, and then things happen at the pool. So just that snippet is what is pulled from the novel and is made into a short film.
And for me, you know, that's a huge task. Like short filmmaking is its own, you know what I mean, its own craft outside of feature film, outside of TV, et cetera, outside of theater. And so, you know, the first thing that you have to think is, why are we here? That question becomes so essential and important because ultimately you're asking people to sit down for like 15 minutes of their time, whatever, to take this in. And it's like, you have to pack so much into a short period of time while also making sure that you are making it worth somebody's time. And so, a trick that I remember always hearing from someone was just that, like, feature films are about small moments expanded, and shorts are always about big moments, kind of compressed. Exactly. And so I knew that the book covered so much. There was this larger journey of Jay's personal, coming of age and his identity, et cetera. And I wanted to, the poet in me wanted to figure out a way for the beginning and end of this this container in the short film to sort of be a metaphor for that journey that he takes in the larger novel. And, this idea of getting in the water became that metaphor. Of Jay's experience of the water, right? And that's when we really start to hone in on the fact that, the where and the why. We're in the deep South, right? The why being this is the first time they've opened up the pool in 2 years after a massive traumatic event, which is all stuff that isn't in the animatic or the Kickstarter, but is an important part of the storytelling. And the excitement around what brings all these people to the pool on this day, and knowing that Jay's relationship to the water is sort of acting as this larger symbol for his relationship to himself. And Keith had this beautiful, beautiful quote that was sort of my North Star in the writing of it all, which is when Black and brown boys play, they heal. And this notion of getting him in the water, but him also learning that the water did not have to be this space to be feared, that he could play. And what was that journey and who would help him get there, right? And so Keith already provided the characters and already provided. So, it became this less about, okay, well, how do you fit all these other elements and dynamics and all these relationships and things that are happening in the novel, right? Because, that's not what the job of this short film is. And, I really wanted to try to replicate what that moment in the story was, which is, it was a moment of reprieve. And so the short film really is this moment of reprieve for all of us, and specifically audiences of color who are so used to, like we talked about, being re-traumatized by these narratives, which mean well a lot of times, but it's just, again, I think there's a lot of conditioning that happens in the industry, certainly does respond a lot more, it seems, to stories that do feature, those moments of pain at some point, because otherwise, how can you appreciate the joy, et cetera? But our argument is that you can do both, and that tension is enough. So anyway, I just made that just as simple as that. It's just a journey of a boy getting into the water, and the other boy he meets who helps him do it. And our kind of thesis, this was this notion that, like, that's enough, right? That's enough in and of itself. There's enough drama in that. There's enough happening in that. There's enough nuance, and the power in saying that story, that something as simple as that is worth being blown up on a big screen, how validating that is. I remember seeing this film called Terrell. It played at Sundance, and it just highlighted microaggression. And the entire climax of the film is this Black man who's invited to his white friend's sort of party in the woods, or not party in the woods, but they're kind of at this cabin, and it's like a weekend retreat, and he's the only Black guy there, and he feels so uncomfortable. And he feels so crazy because he keeps waiting for something to happen, and nothing really happens. He's accepted, they love him, but he's so triggered and traumatized by things that we don't see in the film. But again, as an audience of color, that, like, there are small microaggressions and traumas that happen in that space. And one of them being the fact that his name is Tyler, and this film is called Terrell. And very early in the film, somebody just calls him Terrell by mistake. You know what I mean? And that small microaggression, right? Like, and the entire climax of the film is him sort of like freaking out and crying and breaking down and crying to his white friend who invited him. And his friend is like, dude, like, what is wrong? Like, he's trying to drive away. He wants to get out. And he's like, what is wrong? And I just remember watching that moment and watching him cry. And the entire time you're waiting for somebody to die or something crazy to happen. And that was it. He cried, they walked him back, and like the next day happened and the movie was over. You know what I mean? Like, and I remember the critics really panned that film as like being like nothing happened and nothing was going on. But myself and another, Black friend that watched it with me, we were both like, yo, I've never felt so seen because that crazy moment where you're like, is it me? Am I crazy? Like somebody put on film and made the climax of this larger narrative in a way that that validated that feeling for me. Like, no, I'm not crazy. And in a similar way for me, you know, Pritty does that, where it's sort of like, no, like that is an important moment. I don't need to be yelled at or bullied or, you know what I mean, to kind of like be brought so low for my story to matter and for my being here, you know, on this planet to have some sort of validity. It goes back to that insecurity that a lot of folks feel when applying to colleges, where it's like, dang, do I have to just give a trauma story? Like, is that the only way that I'll be able to get in, is if I talk about all the horrible things that happened to me? And so I think similarly, you know, films have a way of sometimes conditioning us that, you know, your story is only valuable or important or worth telling if there was a big bad thing that happened to you, you know, at some point. And this is, again, like, this is our way of pushing back against that in many ways.
And does that in any way relate to your choice of art style and, you know, referencing Miyazaki films, which are, you know, known to be slice of life? And for me, I'm a Japan filmophile, however you want to say it, and I love animation. And what I love about Japanese storytelling is that it is the relationships that typically drive the story forward, as opposed to action and events, right? It's not an event that happened externally, but rather what you guys, I think, are also exploring, events that are happening internally, not just necessarily within one person, but, you know, maybe resonating between two people or a love triangle, something like that. And that's why I really gravitate towards indie films, Keith, but also in general, more general sense, Japanese films and a lot of slice of life anime, or anime in general. I think it's part of Japanese storytelling. So I wonder if that in any way informed your choice to go with a more Japanese style animation aesthetic, and specifically if that informed your direction towards referencing more Hayao Miyazaki film. No.
Yeah, the bring Hayao to the hood for sure. You know, that was it for, you know, Keith. I don't think you were as familiar with Hayao Miyazaki's work, but for me, it wasn't a hard decision. You know, I don't even think I gave too much thought to it. I just know what that animation style and those films do to me. Mm-hmm. And that I like, when I'm feeling bad, like, I rewatch them. And one thing that I know was very important to me with this film is that it could be a world that people could return to, right? Because again, remind you, this is coming at a point where I'm rewatching a lot of the queer coming of age films, and I'm like, oh, and I'm experiencing certain disappointments as I'm going back, and it's like, dang, so I really want to watch that again. Right? Do I really want to go back to that world? And I'm paying attention to the worlds that I want to go back to. And Call Me by Your Name is something I watched 5 times, despite having lukewarm feelings about the film when I first watched it. And I was always like, why? Like, why do I keep watching this movie? Why do I keep wanting? And it was just so bright. And I was like, I loved the colors. Like, visually, I loved just how bright it was. And when I think about Call Me by Your Name, I just think about those boys running on vacation, and I want to be there. You know what I mean? Like, and so I knew I wanted Pritty, whatever it was, to be something that people could come back to and wanted to come back to. And that it was a world that people could really escape in. And Hayao Miyazaki was always a world I felt so comfortable to escape in. And then it just so happened that, like, oh yeah, and I don't get to see myself in Hayao Miyazaki films, right? That was the sort of afterthought. But, you know, I felt like I went to Hayao first because those are the films that I go to oftentimes when I just want to get away and want to kind of press pause on life.
Yeah. And Keith, before I ask another question, I don't know if you have a comment.
Yeah, no, the quick thing that I'll say is that what was particularly powerful when Terrance showed a few frames from his particular favorite animation stories, I had never seen from that particular, I did not know that Hayao is masterful at that thing. And so when he showed the entire team, we were like, hell yeah. Let's do it. Right. And then I think the second piece is what we all knew quite strongly as people. I think everyone on our team watches animation, but I know me and Terrance probably watched the most. I don't know. We haven't confirmed it. We'll circle back. But one thing that what we knew was just the global reality is that we do not see ourselves. And what we knew about Hayao Miyazaki's work is that it is iconic. No one doubts that. Straight up, it is iconic. But what does it mean to take something that is relegated to high art that, like, I remember Spirited Away broke the box office in Japan. Like, everyone knows it, right? What does it mean to say, hey, there's a nod to this artistry? And what would happen if we brought this artistry and brought individuals who have always been worthy in their stories, and we brought these things together and we left them there and allow people to experience not this huge world sweeping, but to actually almost feel that, like, the thunder and the nod and the lightning and like a leaning in. That's some true high art in and of itself. And so I think it was a really, really, really great choice.
And in the Kickstarter, the word naturalistic or something akin to that comes up a couple of times. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that, because that is a word that, you know, came up a few times and is a theme, I think, for you. So if you could expand upon what that means artistically, what that means specifically for the story of Pritty.
Yeah, I'll try not to get film school nerdy. Probably a neorealism of it all. But no, like the naturalism is really just, you know, does it feel authentic? You know, for me, it's like, does it ring true to whether it be my experiences or the common shared experiences that Keith and I have, right? And I think something that I oftentimes feel a lot, I don't just watch films either. Like I watch a lot of theater. I mean, I watch a lot of theater and read a lot of books, and sometimes you'll experience like moments of like same-sex interaction that like you're just like, this doesn't feel right. Like there's some, like, he would not kiss him there, he would not touch him there, he would not say that would not happen that fast. Do you know what I mean? Like it's just like, and you understand that it's film and some things just have to happen faster. But like it does, for me, it does change something when I'm like, no, there is a real choreography to how men learn to interact with one another, and specifically Black men, right? Like it's like, oh, your culture plays a part in how you approach so much of this. Something we talked about with the animators as we were getting their body like language down. It's like there's a swagger, right? There's a way that you roll up, there's a way that you present yourself, there's a way that you start to steer the conversation into another place and start to say things without saying things. Like there's so much nuance here that can easily be bulldozed over. You know what I mean? Like we could easily have, Jay and Justin kissing by the end of this type of thing. But it's like, would that happen? Now, like, would that happen this fast and in this space? And that's a beautiful image. And, maybe one day we'd love to be able to put that imagery out there. But I think for me, what naturalism means is it just means just being true to what that moment is, true to these characters, like really living, thinking through, okay, where were they before this moment? Where do they go after? What are they literally thinking about when they say this line? When he says, "Are you good?" 3 times, what is he saying each time? You know what I mean? Like when he chooses not to say a thing, what would he have said there? Right? When he reacts in this way, how is he receiving what he said, and what was the actual intention? These are all things that we are thinking through and thinking about because we're magnifying, you know what I mean, these really small, intimate, minute details and showing them to an audience. So that naturalism is really thinking through each of those parts to ensure that there's an authenticity to it, to someone, right? So that's, outside of the actual definition of the word, that's my take.
Yeah, I appreciate that insight. Were you guys at all concerned about the limitations? There's limitations in animation. You can't necessarily animate all fluid movement all the time, and you have to, I guess, pick wisely where you animate the swagger as opposed to just having a still frame. And all of that becomes costly, which is why you're doing a Kickstarter. But was that, check it out, people. Was that at all a concern for you guys as you made this switch to animation? Were there any reservations about the switch to animation? Hesitation?
So, yes, I can speak on that. Because I remember when Terrance was like, hey, animation, I was like, and I think it was because, and this is, it should be noted that this is why Hayao worked, Hayao Miyazaki, this is why this was important. Because the one thing I was concerned about was, in live action, it is sometimes easier to convey those small moments, a register of the eyes and all those kind of things. And by virtue of like being things in an environment, like stuff also just happens and you see it. And it was when he showed us this, I was like, oh, but Hayao Miyazaki captures all of that.
Yeah.
And so the thing that I would point out too, in relation to the naturalistic piece is we cannot forget that part of when we are thinking around naturalism, and in this case, a naturalistic setting, is that where are we? And for us, we are in the deep South in Savannah, Georgia, in a community, right? And so there might have been some restrictions, but I don't think we necessarily had those challenges because we weren't, as the animators really appreciated, we weren't being like, and then Justin is going to jump, and then the water is going to, all the pool's water is going to come up, and then it's going to splash, and then everyone's going to be levitating. Like, that wasn't the story. And so I think the thing that we must always think about is, what is the being story and what serves to further that narrative? So for us, we spent more time thinking around, hey, that hat on Jay's head, is that correct? Is Jay wearing his hat backwards? Is that how he would wear it? Or my favorite, it is essential that there is a car that drives by, that the music is so loud, it is rattling the trunk. And you can't just put a regular song there. It has to have a certain triplet and a double beat. Otherwise, people of color gonna look at this like, that ain't it, right? And so there's a moment of naturalism and authenticity that I think we are also pointing out, that there is a world where we could be like, oh, well, Justin kisses Jay. But that's not the story. That is not the story. And I think the point that Terrance does a really great job of pointing out is that what matters in every coming of age novel and story is not what happens, it's what could have happened. And I think in a movie like this, a short film, there are a lot of people who want to take this like, oh, and so this is a gay film and we do all these things. And we're like, that is an interpretation for sure. But what we are talking about in this moment is that you have Jay, a young man, taking a flower, putting it in his hair, in the hood, in a space where people would imagine is the most intolerant of anything that is not in alignment with Black masculinity, which is harsh, as we've seen it to be on TV, right? The limited portrayals of it. And he is going to a pool where he is insecure in his body and what he can do, next to his brother who does all things and everybody want him, right? And then he sees a boy who, in the understanding of what beauty is in the Deep South and the long history of colorism, a light-skinned boy with light-colored eyes is the object of affection who everybody wants to, right? So we have this moment where all that is happening is that a moment where Jay and Justin and Jacob could have all chosen to not see each other. They see each other. And particularly Jay and Justin see each other. And that is the point. You can elaborate on the story. And that's when we be like, read the book. But the reality is that the reason why we say this is a universal queer narrative is because it is about the possibility. They don't do nothing. It is about the possibility. And what we all know true to ourselves is that if you have ever felt insecure, which you have because you're human, and if you ever wanted to feel valued and be said that you are worthy, which you have because you're human, you know that the moment someone sees you, your world opens up. And suddenly, whether this is a scene with superpowers or not, you feel special. And that is the one thing that every single one of us wants. And that's it. That's the story. So naturalism in this case is you have this story that, would be happening in a beautiful parallel world in a Japanese animation happening on the West Side in Chicago at a community pool where the natural beauty that is Black and brown culture is relegated to the high art that it is. And that's all we got to focus on. That's it.
I love it. Not West Side of Chicago. He meant West Side of Savannah.
Oh, I'm sorry. West Side of Savannah, because I also know people from West Side of Chicago. Sorry. West Side of Savannah.
Ooh, the West Side of Chicago.
You're just speaking to the universality of the story.
Different story, apparently, that we're going to be doing, Terrance.
You said the South Side of Florida, where it go down. But yeah, no, for me specifically, I know I was actually ecstatic to move to animation. I personally am still reconciling my journey as a filmmaker, and being on set is, ironically enough, my least favorite place. It's where the magic happens. But the minute I realized, y'all, there's a pretty chance I don't have to be on set. Like, I can do this from home. Let's do that. Let's go that direction. But no, I think there was just a lot of, I think there was an ignorance too, right? There was so much about animation that we did not know. So we weren't really thinking. It was the opposite for me. I was like, oh, there's so much we can do in animation. The beauty was, we weren't trying to do, and the animation studio actually commented on this often. They were like, it's so refreshing to work on something where, things aren't flipping and samurai swords aren't coming out of and blood isn't gushing out of people's faces. It was just like, for us, we didn't need all of the bells and whistles. We didn't need, Jay levitating and then lightning striking from the sky, which I think if we had maybe approached the story with as an animation from the jump, we probably would have been like, ooh, and then this can happen. And
possibilities.
Right? Yeah. But it was like, no, we didn't change our script. Like, we were like, no, there's actually beauty to keeping our script exactly how it is and just telling the story, but animated. And again, that's also something that led us to Hayao, because it was like, his work often features very realistic, very naturalistic. Of course, there's all this magic around it,
right,
but it's so rooted in a realism that it just kind of feels like you say, a slice of life. And so we knew that we wanted to preserve that aspect of it, even as we transitioned into a new medium.
Yeah. And through the transition, am I right? Did I remember correctly from the Kickstarter that the flower was an addition that's not in the original story?
Yeah, so that was actually in the writing in that adaptation. And so again, trying to think about, these notions and ideas of something that was important is this idea of needing to contextualize what our relationship is to masculinity in this space. And so as I was thinking through, again, this container and this journey to the water, et cetera, it's like, okay, well, cool. Like, how do I make sure that the audience understands why this is so important, right? And understands what this boy's internal journey is, because we don't have something as big as like, and then he kisses Justin. And then, you know what I mean? So it's like, what are those small things that you don't say, you know what I mean? What is that Skittle placed on the S key of your, like those small, seemingly insignificant moments. And then it became this idea, this notion of, a boy putting a flower in his hair. And I think the hardest part of Pritty was having to figure out, why in the hell does he put a flower in his hair? Outside of me, the author, wanting to make that a thing, why would he put a flower in his hair? Talking about the realism, talking about, you know what I mean? Like, why would he do this if he knows that this is not okay? And then it became this larger conversation of why not? Which is something that I say in the Kickstarter, where it's like, if cars can transform, why can't it? And that's where I feel like, Pritty began to work on us also in our kind of expectations and notions of what was realistic. And the fact of the matter is, it was like, there are probably Black boys who do put flowers in their hair. They are, we see them, you know what I mean? Like, and I think that, in any case, I believe there's a world where that does exist and that does happen. And we might not see it and we might not live it and experience it. But I think, again, in our imaginations, why not? And so that flower became this really beautiful, almost like defiant, symbol. I love how we fit it in. Obviously, you have to watch the full short to understand the significance of it. But I love how we, kept it. I love that we fought to keep both Keith and I, and that we wrestled to make sure that that flower in his hair was not just, a symbol for symbol's sake, but that it actually has a relationship for that character. And there's a reason why he does that. And it's a moment in the story where he decides to share that reasoning with Justin, but understanding that symbol as a defiant one, I learned more about Jay, and that he's gonna wear it regardless. He doesn't care what you have to say or what you think, despite also being insecure, right? Which is the contradictory nature of being a teenager, is as you're hyper aware of what everybody thinks while also wanting to be an individual. So he makes a choice, and ultimately it's that choice that piques Justin's attention, and that makes him stand out, whether he wants to or not, at this community pool.
Yeah, and I have to say that I went for a run today, and I was trying to figure out exactly why, aside from it being beautiful animation, this project that really shouldn't resonate with me resonated with me so much. And I think I arrived at it being the flower. And as a kid, I was awkward teenager, coming of age myself, but I wanted to express myself. So even not relating to him as a queer person of color, I could relate to him that I, as a kid, wanted to express myself, and I always dressed in really flamboyant way and stood out. And it wasn't because I wanted attention necessarily, but rather that was who I was. And it's funny, like I don't want to read too much into the Kickstarter because obviously I haven't seen the whole film, but even just seeing what you guys presented and put forth on the Kickstarter, that is what I arrived at having resonated with me so deeply, is regardless of who you are, self-expression matters. Being able to present yourself as who you are matters. And then if you're seen, all the better, right? That's also important. That's also just as important. But if you're not projecting yourself for who you are, then you're not going to be seen for who you are anyway.
Like that's success to me. When somebody can get the story and you ain't read it, you ain't seen it.
That's it. And I think probably what's also powerful too is, and this is the last part that I love that I feel you may have been going to, but I wanted to submit to is, and if you cannot do that, that is in and of itself its own problem. And I think oftentimes the power of something this simple is that it ends up being this very subversive thing, because the number of people who came at Terrance over this flower, the sheer audacity, right? And then that's when we begin to realize, wait a minute, because the whole novel is about masculinity, right? But you don't have 300 plus pages to go through that in this moment, right? And so I think what's really important to point out too is we begin to realize when people attach themselves so hard to this flower that, like, no, he does put his flower in his head. Yes, he is in the hood, and no, nothing happens. And that is transformation, because people are like, that's not possible. We're like, well, why not? Why not? Because it's not. I
love that defiance in the film manifested itself as defiance in the production of the film.
It does. And then what it began to do, which I love, as an organizer and an educator, is it then forces us to make space for a reality, whether it exists for some of our young people and ourselves or not. By virtue of seeing it, it then changes us, because then we say, well, wait a minute. Why is this not the case? Oh, wait a minute. Is this not the case because of X, Y, and Z? What can I do to make sure that it can be the reality that I live in, that you live in, that we live in together? And that's, to me, what powerful transformational change is. And that's why animation is the most powerful vehicle in this case, because this isn't just, everyone loves animation. Everybody. And so it actually took a live action piece, and we still love live action. Don't get it twisted. We still love it. But it actually almost catapulted this narrative and this story that may have only been seen by certain people to a universal perspective, where it's like, now people feel equipped and ready and even safe to venture into territory that they may not have necessarily been ready for if it were a live action. And that in and of itself is also the power of like art to do so.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I know the environments that you guys created are very specific to the Deep South in Black communities, but at the same time, there was something universal about it that also invited me, who I don't have an experience in that environment, but yet I found myself feeling comfortable, welcomed, and familiar. Mm-hmm. And I think that's balancing that this is something specific, but it's also something that anybody could access and relate to in a way, was also an indication of the art, a subtlety that you guys are very craftfully playing with to deliver your message. And there's layers to that message. And I mean, not even say again, I haven't seen the full film or read the full script or anything, but even in the presentation of your Kickstarter, I could get the sense of the layers that are going into not just the finished film itself, but in the creation of the film, the project, the Kickstarter itself. And there's a depth there that isn't always present with other projects that I engage with. And kudos to you guys for pulling me in to that degree.
Praise God. Yeah. I love that. And, I'll just say this last thing, which is that, like, I think as a filmmaker, as artists, you have to figure out a way to measure your success, because it's not often, it's not every day that, somebody just runs up to you and puts an award in your hand, or, claps you on the back and says, you did a great job. And that can be very harrowing as you move through, life and your artistry and your career, to see this thing that you're working on and to never really be sure if you're quite hitting it right or doing it right. And very early on for me, moving from poetry into filmmaking, this medium that I felt wholly incapable and inadequate at, to try to understand, why am I still here? Why do I keep doing this? And recognizing that I needed that metric of success not to look like the conventional success that we're often taught to aspire towards, which is somebody putting a medal in your hand, or, somebody paying you thousands and thousands of dollars to do the thing. But, for me, it became a matter of, well, if I can do enough that we're having the conversation that feels necessary and urgent to me, and that I wish people would have had on my behalf coming up, right? So that I could be, I could avoid many of the pitfalls and trappings that I encountered. If there was a world where that was normalized, and I could be a part of normalizing that in some way, shape, or form by the art that I put out, whether that's happening on a big arena scale or literally at home with my parents and my siblings watching it back, then that feels like success to me. And the sheer fact that, even just hearing you be able to articulate back some of the very arguments that I remember having with professors and folks, who just didn't understand the story, and just didn't understand why we were so passionate about it, feels like success to me, right? So I feel like I cherish this moment so much more than what I can only believe and pray to God is larger success of this project. But I really cherish, a moment like this, because it says that, the very thing we were hoping to do, which is to tell a story that spoke to millions, is quite possible and is in fact happening. So thank you for sharing back with us, what you received from it.
Oh yeah, no, thank you for working on this project and doing what you guys are doing. I think it's amazing. I guess we could wrap up. I don't want to take too much of your time this evening. I know you guys are extremely busy, and there are just 48 hours or so left on the Kickstarter. So be sure to rest when it is totally complete. Do you have any finishing words, Keith? I know that you're in the process of hopefully having your book come into our hands sooner than later. I don't know if you could speak to that in closing. And Terrance, I know that you have Mandingo. is the project, right? I know you have other projects in the works. So in closing, if you could please speak to what we can look to in the future, aside from Pritty, but also including Pritty, like when's it going to be released? How's it going to be released? How can people support you if they listen to this after the Kickstarter is completed and all of that good stuff?
Yeah, so I'll just say really briefly, the story is hopefully coming to you very, very, very soon, right? That exciting part is there. But I think one of the things that I want to point out and just kind of remind us of is that at the heart of this is, in this particular format, is a reality that like, this is the first version of something like this existing. Black queer bodies, a Black centered queer story in animation, and is the first of its kind. And we are still waiting for people to prove us otherwise, because we would love to know. We don't like to misspeak, but from what our research, we haven't found it. And I think what it is important to know is that when you cannot see yourself on TV in some of the most uplifting and transformative and world-bending mediums out there, that has an impact. Because when we can see you, we know the ability for something to be seen means it exists, right? Means that it has the right to exist, means that it has power. It is. And so for so long, it means 2021, so long for folks can speak so candidly about all their favorite shows, but many of those shows don't have them in them. I think one thing I want people to just remember is that by looking at Pritty in animation, I hope it reminds people that we need more stories, and that it isn't around whether a story is intelligible to the masses. It is the fact that we're human. That is enough. That is enough. And I think if we care about the lives and the futures and the imaginations of people of color, if we say we do, then we must make room for the reality that their stories must be on screen. Our stories must be the center, not just the verb to a larger story that really does not show them. And the final thing I'll say is that I fundamentally believe, and I think this is something that me and Terrance talk about all the time, our ability to dream is directly correlated with what we see. And so if we care about having more stories that are universal, but also have the right to not be universal, right? Then what we really need to do is prioritize ensuring that when people look at, stories, when they look at, I find that a person's Netflix profile is really telling, right? Or their Amazon or their Hulu. If we look at the stage that is America, I think it should be as diverse as the people in it. And when it's not, it is only a reminder that harm is happening and there is more way to go. And that until all of these stories are out and thriving fully, none of us get to heal.
I'd like to say, and you could counter me on this if you want, but I want a situation where any story about a human being becomes universal by the fact that they are a human being.
Period.
That's okay.
And all I'll say on Mandingo is very much it is that, right? Mandingo is in and of itself in the title as a stereotype. That language, it's a term surrounding Black male bodies specifically that has its own history that is very much entrenched in the history that is America and transatlantic slavery. And with that narrative, just very much like you said, it is what happens when we bring a human lens to the stereotypes that we've become so well acquainted with. And when we recognize the harm often of those quiet, subtle, nuanced microaggressions that accompany that language and that imagery. that surrounds a specific culture and specifically our bodies and Black male bodies. So that is a project that, as you can see, Keith and I are quite passionate, and we hold on to a thing until it is done, and so we'll just be moving along with that step by step for however long it takes to bring that project to you next. So that's what we got. That's us.
Awesome. And then for Pritty, in closing, speak to how can people find you after the Kickstarter closes?
Yes.
How can they continue to support you before the film is finished? And then when it is finished, where is it going to be distributed? Or
of course, right now, and Keith, you can certainly add, but I was just going to say the first step, if you're hearing this and the Kickstarter has ended, you can follow us at Pritty, not Pretty. You could also follow me at Terrance Daye on Instagram, and Keith at you can share your handle, Keith. I don't want to mess it up. But all that to say, Pritty not Pretty, Pritty, not Pretty, Pretty. You can follow us there at Instagram or Twitter on all platforms for more information about the project. Whatever next steps there are will be certainly highlighted and blasted there. And Keith, if you want to add anything in your handle.
I would just say that, you can certainly continue to follow both of us. You can find me at More Pillow Talk. But the one thing I'll also say is that in the 44 hours until the Kickstarter closes, any donation is greatly appreciated. One of the most affirming and powerful things that we've experienced as we are racing toward our $125,000 goal. The fact is that we're at 91,700 so, and that the bulk of those donations are between $1 and $100. And so what we're seeing is that everyday people are like, hey, I'm going to give you what I can, right? And so what we say is, please give what you can. And for anyone who doesn't reach the Kickstarter in time, that is okay, because you can still give. Just reach out to us. We will let you know. And for us, the Kickstarter ends on Thursday, April the 1st. And then we begin, after a short period of rest, we then begin the next part of, having larger conversations around ways that other people can finance this exciting project outside of the Kickstarter platform. Because what we do know is there's a much larger, higher ticket price, but what reaching these goals that we have so far at Kickstarter allows us to begin moving forward in the fall on that long, exciting journey that is not actually that long. So we're really excited for to share updates with people, and we can't wait. So excited.
Awesome. As are we, and especially me. So thank you guys for joining me here on What's Your Random. You are welcome back anytime. You have another project or want to talk about this one further. And until next time, enjoy your random.
Thank you.
All right. Welcome to the debriefing, my fellow randoms, and thank you for hanging on to join me here at the end of our 28th episode of What's Your Random podcast to talk about ways that I could potentially improve the podcast moving forward and key takeaways from the episode you just listened to. The key takeaways for this episode were many, and I'm still digesting all that I heard and learned, and I had so many ideas and concepts and questions that I wanted to explore over the course of the conversation that I was contending with multiple ideas at once in my mouth. I think I had marbles in my mouth a few times because I wanted to steer in multiple directions at once. And, when you're turning left, you just can't turn right at the same time. So it had to go one way or the other, and I'm glad that it went the ways that it did. Speaking with Terrance and Keith was enlightening and broadened my perspective, and I was definitely thinking about how I am engaging their project versus how a queer person of color is engaging the project and what it means for them versus how, I access it. And I think that's really profound for everyone and anyone, but certainly people who have been underrepresented being represented in the way that Keith and Terrance are representing them. And I'm still very impressed that I'm able to relate to the characters and the story, even though the characters are from another walk of life and I don't belong to that group of people, and yet it's still accessible to me. I think that's really powerful to be able to strike that balance, and I'm impressed. And I just keep thinking about what this means to people who haven't seen a movie like this yet, because it doesn't yet exist, and they are pioneers in that sense. And I want to, again, applaud them for taking on the challenge, because it's not always easy to be a pioneer, especially fighting their own fights, like keeping the flower in the hair, which was something that I related to myself. So that's my key takeaway. I just think that it's an episode that I will revisit, to listen to again, digest what my guest said and think about my own perspective. And as I shared with Keith towards the end, even if the stories are about the most specific group of people who are the most underrepresented, I hope that just by virtue of it being a human story, that it becomes a universal story for all of us to understand one another better and appreciate one another better and see one another better. And I see this project, and I'm very excited for it to be released and to watch the full thing. So thank you again, always, for listening to What's Your Random Podcast through to the end, and sharing if you enjoyed the conversation that you just heard. And until next time, enjoy your random.